I was at the March on Washington on August 28, 1963, somewhat without very much without realizing what would be the ultimate significance of this. I was working with a small civil rights organization in Chicago at the time, and none of the regular staff there could get off to go. So they asked me, a summer part-timer, if I would be willing to lead their delegation to this event that was taking place in Washington. And I said, sure, fine. But that's an indication of how little at the time we suspected the historic quality that this would take on. So I went to Washington from Chicago. We had a train that went overnight from Chicago to Washington, and then the next night went from Washington back to Chicago. And I was also a train car captain on that train from Chicago, which was a nice experience as well, interacting with the people on the train. So it was not, I was not a principal at all. I was just one of the people who happened to be there. I would say that subsequent to being there, and especially in recent years, as people have begun, I think, even more to appreciate the historic quality of the I Have a Dream speech, I feel like I've been given a gift of having been there and having heard the speech, and that I need to share this with others. So I try to. The crowd estimates of how many were there tended at the time to focus around 210,000. It's now more common to say 250,000, which is twice the size of any sports stadium that I know of. And yet it did not have that kind of all-absorbing world mega event quality to it at all at that time. It got television coverage, but it was an afternoon, and it was not a big deal. Any rock concert now tends to get more attention, any Olympics and World Cup and those kinds of things. So it was not an all-consuming important event. Well, I would say that to me the power of being there comes from three things. First, the historical moment. This was a critical time in the civil rights movement in the United States, and actually in human rights movements all over the world. And King's articulation of the dream became a kind of an anthem, a theme song to people not only in the civil rights movement, but everywhere. I've met people from all over the world, India, China, Germany, you name it, who studied it in school, who really know a lot of the context, know the nature of the speech. And the second thing that really sets it apart is the text, what King talked about, because he drew in the most powerful statements and documents from American history, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, gospel songs, patriotic songs. All of those are worked into this speech to create a really positive, powerful set of images and calls to action. And the third thing that made it work that's really obvious is his delivery. King's voice, his pacing, his rhythm, and in that his interaction with the audience, where the audience was part and parcel of his delivery, a call-response kind of thing that is a tradition in the African American church, of which he was very much a part, where the speaker draws responses out of the crowd and then builds on those and then carries you up and brings you down. So those were the things that really, to me, set apart this speech and made it such an amazing experience to be present for. Well, to me, I think the most striking moment of the March on Washington was when King began to speak. Because you have to realize the context was that we had all been traveling overnight, almost everybody there, or more than that. We're tired. It was a hot August day in Washington, which is miserable weather at best, humid, tedious. We'd been hearing speakers and other things all day. And by mid-afternoon, I was tired, and it seemed like a lot of people were. We were kind of ready to get back on the rides back home. And then King started speaking, and everything was transformed. It was just amazing. The first moments of his voice, that familiar voice that we all knew, and the power of it, and the pacing, the deliberateness, the seriousness, just suddenly had grabbed everybody and changed the whole environment. And from there on, he took us with him on this journey into his dream and to the phrases and the power and the vision that he was offering. And so the opening of it, which is not very dramatic and doesn't get quoted much, but just the way his presence made that was a powerful experience. Well, curiously, although it's now 50 years since the speech, I never talked about it in my classes or generally in public about being there until the last 10 years. The 10 years I've been at Royal Roads University. This kind of drew it out of me. The interest in the historical quality of it, and of a report from somebody who was there and who's still alive, because 50 years is a long time, that seems to be a very powerful hook to the learners at Royal Roads that I've been working with. So I've learned to use it as kind of a culminating session in classes that I teach about communication, that here is an act of communication that works like nothing else I have ever seen. And how and why it works is something to think about. And so then we do a class session about, rhetoric and the power of persuasion and what elements are necessary to go into that. And it becomes, I think, a really useful kind of entree into elements of rhetorical analysis, the power of the word, words well chosen and well presented can move the world. And so I try to share that in the classroom. The ultimate effect of the speech and the historical reputation is a great surprise to me. Being there, present at it, you don't know you're at part of history when it's happening. It's just something you're part of. It was a good speech. It was very powerful. Everybody who was there was incredibly moved by it. But we didn't know how the rest of the world was going to respond. We didn't know whether it was even being carried well in the press, and it was so-so coverage in the press. And if anybody had asked me then if I thought 50 years from now people in Canada are going to be very interested in your account of being at this speech, I'd have said, oh, come on, you're joking. So I don't think I had, and I think a lot of other people would share this, a sense that this was going to become a big chunk of history. It was a great event, and we were really happy to be part of it. But so many of those things just kind of wander off. The civil rights movement was full of wonderful events. I had been at the memorial service a year after the death of Medgar Evers in Mississippi, and his widow was there, the bishop, his brother were there, and so on, and it was a beautiful and really moving ceremony. And of course, like so many things at the time, it was in a high school gymnasium. It ended with everybody in a big circle holding hands and singing, "We Shall Overcome." And, wow, a moment that you feel privileged to have ever had in your life. So it's a surprise to me what power this speech has taken on historically, but I'm really happy that it has. The speech has taken on a historical quality already in 50 years, and I think that will continue. The reasons it's historical, it came at that crucial time. It was so beautifully done, so perfectly done. It's such a positive speech and experience. I think that will continue. I think that it was selected by international rhetoricians as the greatest speech of the 20th century, at the end of the 20th century. It was. And that's against a lot of serious competition. There were great speakers in the 20th century. Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, John Kennedy, Lenin, Hitler, good and bad. They were really powerful speakers who could move crowds tremendously. And to be selected as the number one out of all of that, I think says that this speech has real lasting power. It's going to be there for a long time. I think it's going to be like, the works of Shakespeare and the great pieces of history that become recognized even more with time. There are one other thing about the effect, the immediate effect. When King finished speaking, everybody was, so bound together and so feeling the emotions that he was evoking. It was illustrated by the guy standing next to me, a tall black guy from the South who had been holding a sign. And when King finished, he put the sign down on the ground, leaned on it, and he wept like a baby. Just, that was where we all were at that time. Just, what do you say? What can you do? You just appreciate the moment, the time, rededicate yourself to the cause. Say, it's wonderful to have had such a peak experience of what we all care most about and are struggling for, and that has been captured so perfectly by the man who, by that crowd, was admired most of all. There is another side to that. In 1963, Martin Luther King was not a universally respected figure. He was much opposed in the U.S., especially at that time. The top law enforcement official in the United States, J. Edgar Hoover, was an enemy of King. The FBI was not only not providing protection to King, they were sabotaging his work. They were bugging his phone calls. They were passing on rumors about his private life. Hoover hated King and was accusing him of communism, was doing anything he could to undercut him. And that was fairly typical of a broad spectrum of opinion in America, that this guy's a troublemaker. He gets people all riled up about things that are should be dealt with in more calm ways. He gets arrested and goes to jail. He gets other people to participate in these things. And when 2 years later, 1965, King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, there was a lot of shock in the United States that how could they recognize this outside troublemaker? And even when he was assassinated 5 years after the march in 1968, there was tremendous opposition to King. It's only kind of long since then, a national holiday in his name and a kind of a recognition that he was a marvelous figure and he presented so many positive things, and the civil rights movement was, we realize in retrospect, the right thing to do. Then suddenly King is like this perfect elder statesman, but it wasn't that way at all at the time. Another historical comparison that I think is a bit striking is if you had asked me, and probably a lot of people at the march in 1963, will there be an African-American male president of the United States in less than 50 years? We'd have laughed. I mean, blacks couldn't use the same water fountains. They couldn't sit at the same eating counters. They couldn't vote in many parts of the country. Blacks were really seriously discriminated against, either overtly with the Jim Crow laws and segregation in the South, or more covertly with institutionalized racism in the North, where the neighborhoods were all black or white, the schools were black or white. The reality of segregation and racial discrimination, injustice, and stereotyping was very profound. And the idea that the American public would elect a black president was like inconceivable. And yet, less than 50 years later, Barack Obama became president. And he's in his second term now. It's amazing. Just, it makes you It's very encouraging. Makes you realize, yep, we can make progress. We can look at problems and deal with them, and things can be better. That's not to say that all of the speech's dream has been realized, not by any means. There's so much unfinished work. If Dr. King were alive today, he would be fighting issues of people all over the world who are suffering from malnutrition, injustice, unemployment, groups of people, individuals. All of that is still there. And now we're aware of it on a global scale that in 1963 was not so obvious or easy to access. Now we know that there are grave injustices in the world that need to be addressed. And Dr. King would be talking about those now if he were still with us. And that's what his concern would be. And I think he'd also be very concerned with climate change and global warming and addressing the issues of the environment, because he was always very alert to the issues. He finally only, in the last couple of years of his life, he came out against the Vietnam War. He had been careful to not take positions on controversial issues because he wanted to focus on civil rights, on African Americans and problems. Didn't want complications for being associated with other things. But by 1965, 66, he was talking about the disproportionate number of blacks who were serving and dying in Vietnam, the impracticality of the war, and was against it. And I think that in the same way he would have moved vigorously into the environmental movement today and helped articulate and raise consciousness of the seriousness of this and the need to address it in policy, in daily activities across the board. Do I think there will ever be another speech like it? Yes, but humankind might have to wait 1,000 years for it.
It just seems like everything.
The first part of the speech was scripted, although you don't see him ever read anything, and they didn't have those fancy electronic teleprompters. He was an incredible public speaker with a fabulous memory of text and how to generate the most power from it. And so the first part of the speech had been written by Clarence Jones, who has written a wonderful book about it, Behind the Dream. But then, and the informal word on it is about halfway through the speech, Mahalia Jackson, who had sung earlier in the program, who was sitting near him on the podium, said, "Martin, tell him about the dream." And shortly after that, he shifted into the I Have a Dream, which he had used partly in a speech in Detroit previously, a month or so before. But he went right into that, and then from there went into the with this faith, we will go back to Georgia with this faith, etc. So he repeated the I Have a Dream a number of times. Then he used the phrase with this faith, and then he used the phrase let freedom ring. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous hills of California. Let freedom ring from Stone Mountain in Georgia, which when he'd talk about the country and the various parts of it, then he'd hit the South. Then the crowd would really react because there were a lot of people from the South, and that was a lot of the focus of his work and the civil rights movement. But the what he did with the phrasing, the I Have a Dream, the Let Freedom Ring, the With This Faith, was so sophisticated in terms of oral traditions, knowing how you make something sound. You repeat phrases, you work the crowd into it. They begin to recognize it. They know how to respond. So that whole call-response tradition of the African American church was part and parcel of how he was delivering this. And it was amazing that he was able to take the crowd kind of up with him to a peak and then bring us down and quiet and then back up and then sustain it. And so the way he uses the phrase I have a dream, for example, varies. I have a dream today, that one day, black boys and girls and white boys and girls will sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream today. He'd repeat the phrase. Then he'd maybe use it in a different way in the next phrase. And all of that allowed the crowd to realize what he's saying, to get a feel for it, and to be very engaged with the cadence that he used for that. And those elements, which are really obvious if you watch a YouTube version of it, particularly the last 9 minutes, which is all of the I Have a Dream bit. It's only about 6 or 7 minutes that most people are familiar with. But if you watch that, you can see that, yeah, he knew what he was doing, and he did it so right. He really, really did. Even the ending, the way he finishes it, is right out there. He's, in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Great God Almighty, free at last. The crowd explodes. It's amazing. He was the best. Yeah. There's a lot more to talk about, King's whole history. He the way he earned the reputation he had, the sacrifices he made, his incredible dedication to the cause, his personality too. He had a sense of humor, and he was a bit unconventional at times. There was a story about his working on a voter registration campaign in Selma or somewhere, and they were going into places to recruit voters, and he went into a pool hall and got the guys in there who were drinking beer and shooting pool interested, and they said, "Come on and play with us." So he shot some pool with them, which to Baptists is a really dangerous thing, but he'd gone to school in the North. He learned to play pool, no problem. He was a really versatile guy and so dedicated. I mean, he wrote wonderful books. He delivered great speeches. He developed, in the same year, 1963, earlier in the year, he wrote the very famous letter from Birmingham City Jail, which they had to smuggle out of the jail on, backs of envelopes and sheets of toilet paper and whatever he could find to write on. And it's an incredibly eloquent and well-documented statement of what the civil rights movement is all about. And he quotes widely from historical figures all over, throughout history and all over the world. Gandhi, for example. That was all from memory. He didn't have a library at his disposal in the Birmingham City Jail. So Dr. King was a lot more than just the I Have a Dream speaker. He was a massively important figure in leading the civil rights movement, and in so doing that, changing the history of America and a lot of things beyond America. And I feel very, very fortunate to have been there. Well, Obama can turn it on. He generally doesn't let himself. He tries to stay calm and kind of deliberate when he's speaking. But particularly in 2008, that campaign, when he really needed to fire up people, and the Yes We Can theme and the hope theme and so on, and he would get a crowd going, and he knew how to carry them along and work with them and get the call response going, and showed a tremendous power as a speaker. He tends to tone it down a lot in his usual presentations, but I feel at times like he's channeling King. I mean, he gets some of the phrasing and the rhythm that you associate with Dr. King right into his own delivery. Mm-hmm. Barack Obama is certainly like an omega that King is the alpha of, a beginning and completion. But it's not over.